네, 그럼 먼저 저희 소개부터 잠깐 올리고 난 다음에 시작을 하도록 하겠습니다. 저희는 현재 한양대학교 희망한대 SDGs 앰베서더라는 동아리에서 이제 SDGs에 대해서 같이 공부도 하고 한양대학교 내에 좀 알리는 그런 활동을 진행하고 있는 동아리입니다. 저는 이제 회장을 맡고 있는 이제 최서윤이라고 합니다.
저는 팀원을 맡고 있는 김소영입니다. 그럼 본격적으로 질문 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 커리어와 관련된 질문 드리려고 하는데요. 세계은행에서 30년 이상 근무하시면서 인프라, 도시개발, 젠더, 공공민간 파트너십 등 다양한 국제개발 분야에서 활약하셨다고 들었습니다. 월드뱅크에 계셨을 때 하셨던 일에 대해서 소개해 주실 수 있으실까요?
Great. Well, it's such a pleasure for me to be here today and to meet the SDG Ambassadors Club. I think it's so important for everybody in the world to be aware of what the SDGs are. So it's a real pleasure for me to meet those people that are really particularly interested in SDGs. I worked at the World Bank for about 30 years, and most of my work focused on building basic infrastructure and supporting countries to operate that type of infrastructure. And that opportunity was given to me specifically because in 1992, the Soviet Union opened up to the market economy. And as a result, a huge number of privatizations were planned and implemented. Therefore, people that had private sector experience were needed to help to rebuild these economies in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. And while I also worked on privatizing companies and manufacturing companies, what was really needed was to bring in private operations for operating basic infrastructure facilities where people will live, to build and rebuild the communities for families and their children and their futures.
Thank you. 감사합니다. 다음으로 현재 소속되어 계신 글로벌 워터 파트너십에서 어떤 일을 하고 계신지 여쭤봐도 될까요?
Today I am the technical committee chair of the Global Water Partnership, which is a network of regional and country water partnerships and partners in over 180 countries. We have about 2,800 partners in the world, and all of the partners are working towards SDG 6.5.1 and 6.5.2 particularly. And I know that your members know what they are, but 6.5.1 is integrated water resources management, and 6.5.2 is transboundary water management.
Thank you. 다음으로 월드뱅크에서 이제 글로벌 파트너십으로 이직하게 되신 과정을 설명해 주실 수 있으실까요?
Great. So at the World Bank is currently the largest global financial institution, that multi-development bank. But most of that work is primarily in lending World Bank funds to countries for them to develop their policies. That is a paradigm that was so important after World War II. In fact, the World Bank was created to rebuild Europe. So the first borrowers of the World Bank were European countries. But after Europe was able to rebuild itself, the new mandate of the World Bank became to alleviate poverty and to bring growth in all countries in the world. And so at the World Bank, there's a huge emphasis on actually lending World Bank funds to ensure that countries are able to grow and to develop. But the world has been changing now, and one of the things that's very apparent is that there is capital in the world. Global financial flows are much faster and much larger than they used to be 45, 50 years ago. You can get capital from private sector as well as other public sector. So I became very interested in what is a possibility to partner with the private sector and to really partner with other knowledge institutions to bring about change. So an organization like Global Water Partnership is a knowledge and a capacity broker. And so that was the work that I wanted to do. I think that's a much bigger goal. And in some cases, you could argue that countries need knowledge more than they need funding.
Thank you.
네, 그럼 다음으로는 좀 더 개인적인 질문을 드리고 싶은데요. 일단은 첫 번째로는 연사님께서는 혹시 어떤 계기로 국제개발협력 분야에서 이제 일하게 되셨는지가 궁금합니다. 저희가 찾아본 바에 따르면 연사님께서 스탠포드 대학교 경제학 전공과 MBA를 하신 것으로 알고 있는데 이제 어떤 계기로 지금의 길을 걷게 되셨는지 또 해당 전공은 경력에 어떤 영향을 미쳤는지 한번 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Okay, so I'm going to go back a little bit farther than Stanford University. Let's go back to 1962, when I was born. When I was born, our country was one of the poorest countries in the world. I'm sure you or maybe even your parents don't remember, but it was one of the poorest countries in the world. In fact, we received development aid from Nigeria. We received development aid from the Philippines. The World Bank came to South Korea in 1960s, and they looked around to see what can we do to help this country. And they went back and they said, you know, this country has no resources. The people are so poor. We don't know what we can do to support this country. If you remember at that time, in fact, the GDP of South Korea was lower than the GDP of North Korea. And that's because North Korea had minerals, whereas our country had a lot of mountains and a lot of rivers. That was about it, and our human capital. So my father worked at the United Nations Development Program, and he was posted first in South Korea. He was working in South Korea, and then in 1970 he was posted as the UNDP specialist in Saudi Arabia. And then subsequently he traveled around to many different countries, and as children we followed my parents around. And one of the things that I remember thinking as I was living in these countries is what an amazing, noble profession it is that you can help countries to go from developing to rich countries. And that was really one of my goals, my absolute goals. And so I went to elementary school in Saudi Arabia, then high school in the United States, and I was trying to think about, okay, what can I study? How can I, learn to get a job at the World Bank or the United Nations? And every time I asked, people who worked at the World Bank or United Nations, one of the things that I did was that I would just ask questions to anybody I knew that worked at these organizations. What does it take? How can I get a job there? What kind of a career does that mean? Every single one of them said, if you want to work at the World Bank, you need to have a PhD. So by the time I became into university, I could already tell what kind of a person I am. I'm not the kind of person that could sit for 4 years and do a PhD. And that's the minimum at that time that you could do a PhD in. I really preferred to do my learning outside the classroom and to really get my hands dirty in working. And so I kept asking, I had so many interviews of people who worked at the World Bank. I said, how do you get a job? Every single time they said, it has to be a PhD. And so I thought, okay, well, my dream of working at the World Bank, I have to put that away because I really don't think that I could do a PhD. I pursued an MBA, and I did my MBA at Stanford also, and that was much more suited to my personality. I really like the problem solving. I really like the very fast action. And so then I went into management consulting. I had a company that was run by Harvard Business School professors. And so I was just doing straight corporate strategy consulting based in Boston. And then the world changed, and in 1992, the Soviet Union opened up. And suddenly, the World Bank needed private sector specialists. And at that time, they started hiring dozens and dozens of people with MBAs. So that was the opportunity for me, and I joined the World Bank at that time. But let me go a little bit farther. So I started working at the World Bank, and there were so many MBAs like me who basically we said we would work here for free because we are so excited about this noble goal of the World Bank. So I also went to meet people. I used to work for a consulting company called Monitor Company. And so I went to look up all the people at the World Bank who used to work at McKinsey, at BCG, at Bain & Company, all these other leading consulting companies. And I said, isn't it great that we're here? It's so exciting. And, what do you think, how can we, really support the world? And a few of them that had been there for a couple of years said, Jay, in the beginning, it's great. We all start by saying, the mission is so noble. But after 2 years, you realize that it's actually a job. So it's a job like any other job. There are exciting moments and there are frustrations. So you have to really like the work that you do and find that work interesting. And I think that was really great advice, because really in my 30-year career at the World Bank, I found almost every single project so exciting. And I think maybe some of it is my personality. Whenever I'm given a project, I always find something that's interesting in that project and then really do it. I'm not one of these people that when you get a homework that I can just do the homework. I have to find something interesting. And the work of the World Bank is interesting. Why? Because even though the world has developed in so many ways, nobody knows still why some countries develop and other countries don't. And all the economists and development practitioners, they all have theories, but not every country falls into those theories and those models. As I mentioned before, the aid to World Bank came from Nigeria, from Ethiopia, from the Philippines. And now, 60 years later, look at where South Korea is and look at where those three countries are. What happened in our country? What happened in their countries? There isn't an easy and clear theory that explains that change in economic development. And that's why it's so exciting. I used to, most people at the World Bank, even when they come home from work, let's say at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, they're still thinking about work. And when I talk to my friends that worked in other jobs, they said, oh, it's, Saturday, you're still thinking about work, because the challenge is so great.
Thank you. 그러면 방금 해주신 이야기들을 바탕으로 약간 본인만의 가치관이나 인생의 목표가 있으시다면 어떤 것이 있을까요?
Yeah. So I think I left Korea when I was 8 years old. And during the time when I was living abroad, Korea went through an enormous change. And so I started learning about Korea about 10 years ago. And to really understand the science or the economic theory, how did our country develop to become one of the top 20 economies in the world? That's a tremendous feat that no other country has achieved so far. And so really trying to learn that is so important. But along the way, when Korea developed, new challenges came in the world and new ways of understanding society came in the world. So what are some new challenges that I think are so important? I think gender equality is a critical goal that I think I wish for every society to meet. And neither in the US, nor in Korea, nor in many other countries in the world has gender equality been achieved. The second is public-private partnerships. This dream about the public and private sector working together is still not a solid achievement in many countries. So what are some ways to actually develop those partnerships, develop the contracts and the ways that these organizations can work together? I think that's a second goal. And then the third, but probably the overarching goal, is climate change. You know, climate change is affecting countries more than ever. And whether you agree that it's happening or whether you disagree with the science, we can actually see the impacts everywhere. And I think that's one of the reasons that I chose to work at Global Water Partnership, because water is one of the most vulnerable aspects of countries that are affected by climate change.
Thank you. 그러면 연사님께서는 현재 월드뱅크에서부터 현재 글로벌 워터 파트너십에 근무하기까지 굉장히 오랜 시간 국제개발 협력 분야에 몸담고 계신데요. 혹시 인상 깊은 순간이 있다면 언제가 있을까요?
There are so many. That I have felt. Let me just give you a few examples. One of the projects that I worked on was the privatization of the storage system in Antalya, Turkey. And at that time, Antalya was the third largest city in Turkey, but very underdeveloped. And the mayor of Antalya wanted to make it a tourist capital of Turkey, which is difficult because there are so many interesting aspects in Istanbul and in Ankara. But one of the things that really prevented that city from growing was the lack of a sewerage system. And so he asked the World Bank, please help me to develop a private contract for the sewerage system. And I was sent to Antalya to help to review the contract and to help the government contract with a private company to manage the sewerage systems. And my job was basically from 8 to 8 every day, going through hundreds of contract pages. A normal public-private partnership takes about hundreds of pages of contract. It's basically a series of legal agreements between the public sector and the private sector to really foresee any possible happenings and to see how will they be resolved. And so what I did was I flew to Antalya, checked into the hotel at night. In the morning at 7 a.m., I went into the city office and I started going through contracts. And I went through contracts basically for 7 hours every single day and explaining all the questions that the city officials had to what it actually meant. And the city officials were very nervous because they had never brought in the private sector before. And they were worried that the private sector would, try and take advantage of the country. And so that work was, in a way, quite boring on a moment-to-moment basis because all I was doing was looking at legal documents. But one day, I was working very late. I left at 10 p.m. at night. And the city was quiet because by that time, many people had already, gone to sleep and there was nobody on the road. But when I opened the door to go outside, I could suddenly smell the sewage. And I remember thinking, if the contract that I'm doing is successful, Antalya's residents will not have to smell this anymore because there will be a good operation, good, efficient operation. So it's that type of kind of systems change that I went for. Let me give you another example. I want to give you an example of a Vietnam project that the World Bank did. And this was to help to teach sign language to deaf children. And in Vietnam, like in many countries, support for handicapped people is quite limited. It's limited really only to the big cities. So in Hanoi or Saigon, you can find support for handicapped people. But in the villages or in the smaller towns, you can't do that. So the World Bank actually went and developed a sign language course for the small towns and rural villages. And of the different type of disabilities, deafness is quite difficult. Because if children are blind, it's obvious. You can see that they're blind. But when babies and little children are deaf, you can't really tell. You'll talk to them, but they can't hear you, so they don't respond. So in many countries, they are misdiagnosed as having learning disability, not as having deafness. So this really inhibits their growth and really has huge, devastating impact on the quality of life that they have. And so this curriculum taught sign language to deaf children in small cities and villages in Vietnam. And we went to visit some of them. And one of these families, the teacher came to us and they said that this little girl that had been taking this sign language course, within 6 months, they could tell such a huge difference. Because she would go to school, but because she couldn't hear what was happening, she wouldn't participate. She would be very quiet and she would just sit off in the corner by herself. But as she learned sign language and how to communicate with each other, she just became a completely different person and became much more active and started to participate in class. And so the teacher said, you have changed not only this girl's life, but her family's life and her future children's life. And so the great thing about the World Bank is that it works on so many different dimensions. I started my work in infrastructure and public services, but then I was also able to develop work in terms of the entire systems of economics and public services that are non-infrastructure, such as public health services. So yes, I did find it really exciting for the entire 30 years of my career at World Bank.
Thank you. 마지막으로 그 연사님처럼 국제기구에 합류하고 싶어하는 젊은 세대들에게 한 말씀 해주시면 좋을 것 같은데요. 혹시 국제기구에서 일하고 싶은 학생들에게 꼭 필요한 자질은 무엇이 있고 또 마지막으로 한마디 조언해 주시면 감사할 것 같습니다.
Great, thank you. Well, I think having a passion for development and an awareness of what that is really important. But the second thing is there are some techniques to getting a job at the World Bank or other multilateral development banks. So the first thing that's most important is that you have to have experience in a developing country. So it's not impossible. It is possible to get a job at an international institution if you only have Korean experience. It's possible. But if you have developing country experience, that will be much better. And that would be almost a minimum of 6 months, and most desirably kind of more than a year of developing country experience. And that's because Korea is not a developing country. When I was born, Korea was a developing country, and therefore, if you only have Korean experience, that was still okay. But people in Korea today don't always understand the realities of a developing country. So experience in a developing country is very important. But the next thing is when you understanding the application process. When you apply to an international institution, the first thing you will do is to prepare a CV and a cover letter. And that is very important. You have to have a cover letter and a CV that's written in a way that the institution can understand what you do. So, for example, in Korea, everybody understands what Hanyang University is, what kind of a school it is. But you may be sending your CV to an international recruiter who does not know what Hanyang University is. So you need to actually explain those things. The second is that it's unlike Korean culture to boast about yourself. but it's very important in an international culture to be able to clearly state what you can do. So, president of the SDG Ambassadors Club, that would be a very interesting and important thing to put on your CV. Whether you were selected or whether you were elected, that's also important to show that, yes, I was able to compete from these group of people and actually reach a certain status. Your class rank is important also, but you also have to put the description. So I was top 10% of a class of 300 people, for example, so that people understand what a large university it is and what kind of competition you were able to kind of survive and lead. So I think having that cover letter and the CV is very important. And in many US universities, they have a career center where they will give counseling on how to write a CV and to how to write a cover letter. So I don't know if Hanyang University also has that, but that's very important.
Thank you. And 마지막으로 SDG 관련된 질문 하나를 드리고 마무리를 하려고 하는데요. 연사님께서는 세계은행그룹 지속가능개발 및 UN 담당 수석 자문관으로도 활동하셨고 현재 연세대학교 지속가능발전 교수님으로도 계신 걸로 알고 있습니다. 연사님께는 SDGs가 어떤 의미가 있을까요?
The SDGs right now are the only set of goals that every country in the world needs to follow. So, you know, it's so important to have a goal and a target because then every person, every country can work towards achieving that target. But the second thing is, did you know that the SDGs were launched under Ban Ki-moon when he was the Secretary General of the UN? So in a way, it's even more meaningful for Koreans, I think, to really support countries to achieve the SDGs. And I think it's really fantastic that Korea is really bringing some tools and some resources that are very important and needed. When President Yoon was at the UN last year, he made a statement to support the SDGs through Korea's skills in digital environment, digital economy, and AI technology. And I think one of the things that the world needs to do, if we currently progress to the SDGs at the current level, nobody will reach SDGs by 2030. So we need to find some tools and techniques that will help us to achieve that much faster. And I think AI is there. And I think Korean skills in AI and the way to actually use AI is very important for the future. So I'm really excited to be in Korea and to meet the young people that will not only achieve SDGs in our country, but also SDGs for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
그럼 이렇게 저희가 준비한 질문은 마무리가 되었는데요. 이렇게 SDGs에 관련된 답변까지 너무 잘 준비해 주셔서 감사합니다. 그럼 이렇게 인터뷰 마치겠습니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.